The medieval church played, let's call it, a complicated role in the development of the Western magical tradition. While often considered from the point of view of the sorcery trials, the tortures of the Inquisition, or the witch trials that raged for centuries during the early modern period, the church of the period of high scholasticism, beginning at the very beginning of the mid 12th century, was much more complicated in how it dealt with the practice of magic, even how it dealt with the practice of something like necromancy, a crime at that time. And this is nowhere more apparent than the life, writings, and teachings and the magical practice of Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, the Doctor Universalis, the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, and the bedrock of scholastic philosophy. His student Ulrich of Strasbourg claimed that he was inspired in all fields of knowledge and experienced in the magical arts. And indeed, a generation after him, Johannes de Beck famously declared that Albertus Magnus was great in necromancy, greater in philosophy, but greatest still in theology. But still great in necromancy. And for 800 years, Albertus Magnus has been associated with magic and the occult, from his authentic writings to grimoires detailing the use of a corpse's hand as sinister sorcery. But what does Albertus's actual writings reveal about the position of magic, divination, astrology, the production of talismans, and perhaps even most shocking, his own interactions and experimentations with non-physical entities? What can we learn about the occult works attributed to him? And most importantly, what's his position on magic reveal about just how complicated the relationship between Christianity and the occult has been through history? I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica. I'd hope you considered subscribing and supporting the work I do here by taking a look at my Patreon or some of the cool merch that we have on the channel. But now, let's take a look at the history of Christian occultism, the 13th century universal genius, Albertus Magnus. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Probably born in the decade just prior to the turn of the monumental 13th century and living for over 80 years, Albert of Launingen was born into just a touch of privilege. Educated in Aristotle at Padua, who'd become a Dominican in the 1220s, and he began lecturing both at the most prestigious theological institution in Europe at that time, there at Paris, but also closer to his home at Cologne in Germany. During this time, he became the teacher of none less than Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest luminaries the West has ever produced. Among numerous other brilliant students, he would begin to compose commentaries on virtually all of the works of Aristotle with the aid of the great Muslim philosophers. Especially influencing him were Avicenna and Averroes. Indeed, Albert was said to have taken up the task of doing nothing less than completing the works of that great Stagirite, completing the works of Aristotle. Albert would rise through the ranks of his order. He would be sent on peace delegations, both sacred and secular, and he would help to found the great University of Cologne, still standing hundreds of years later in that city. He would rise to the rank of bishop only to resign that position a few years later, and his learning was absolutely astounding. The 1899 collected work spanned some 39 substantial volumes covering virtually every domain of medieval human knowledge, and as we'll see, even some superhuman knowledge. He would outlive many of his students, and he would pass from this world on the 15th of November, 1280. He would eventually become canonized and proclaimed a doctor of the Church on the 16th of December, 1931 by Pope Pius XI, and is now recognized as a patron saint of scientists. But, as we'll see through this episode, he could just as well be the patron saint of sorcerer, as he very carefully and very often blurred the line between natural and supernatural philosophy. But part of what makes it difficult to appreciate Albertus Magnus as Albertus Magus are a few issues. The first is his massive and difficult philosophical, religious, and scientific output, in which he positions himself on topics in the occult that are often just buried in otherwise extremely difficult scholastic philosophy, as if you wanted to wade through all that to get an off-the-cuff statement about summoning spirits. Secondly, Albertus is actually very careful to address such occult topics with differing degrees of focus, clarification, and even condemnation, strategic condemnation, based on the topic of the scope of his discussion. For instance, his earlier theological works are much more quickly to condemn sorcery, especially sorcery having to do with the conjuration of spirits, than, say, his more strictly philosophical or scientific works. Thus, theology might bury that subtlety or that distinction which is otherwise present in other works, which in turn otherwise greatly lessens a stricture on occult practice. What's really clearly condemned in a theological work is going to have a bit more wiggle room in one of the scientific or philosophical ones. Thus, a blanket condemnation on spirit conjuration in his early commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard is significantly retracted or at least tweaked, perhaps sometimes even reversed by his own confession in, for instance, his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, as we'll see. Finally, there are a range of texts attributed to Albert, from alchemical treatises to diabolical grimoires, which have accumulated over the centuries. Now, some of these texts were likely produced within Dominican circles of Albert, perhaps by his students, or maybe even reflecting his own thoughts. They might even be by him for all we know. While others are as wonderful as they are completely spurious and fraudulent, produced centuries after Albert's death. Thus, to get at the occult philosophy of Albertus Magnus and really at the foundations of Christian occultism, we have to take a rather difficult synoptic glimpse of his work, letting his scientific and philosophical dimension often temper his more sacred strictness or strictures before then turning to those Pseudo-Albertine or Albertine adjacent texts which ultimately produce his legacy as both a scholastic and as an occult philosopher. But to appreciate Albertus Magnus as Albertus Magus, we must first appreciate the inheritance of the language of magic that he's received through the history of Christianity. Specifically, Augustine and Isidore of Seville both taxonomized and largely discredited the practice of magic, nearly entirely taken as the work of just demonic trickery. And while William of Auvergne, a generation prior to Albert, would introduce the concept of natural magic to denote the processes of detecting, unlocking, and instrumentalizing hidden forces of nature, Albert, for whatever reason, just doesn't take that tract at all. Indeed, rather shockingly, he just adopts the otherwise scandalous term necromantia or necromantia, a term most often associated exactly with diabolism in pacts with demons. Or at least it would be soon after Albert's death. But even around Albert's time, this term was also undergoing subtle transformations. Petrus Alfonsi and Godelissimus would go on to classify necromantia or necromantia according to physics. They claimed it as a division of physics, as one of the liberal arts, divided into 9 parts dealing with elemental, spiritual, and demonic magic, and further associations of medicine, navigation, or optics, but most specifically with the production of talismans, astrology, and alchemy, getting us in more firmly esoteric land. Thus, the generation prior to Albertus Magnus was already setting the stage for a general loosening up of some of those restrictions inherited from Isidore and Augustine, which had existed prior and which would actually go on to be reinforced after Albert. For instance, his student, Thomas Aquinas, would be much more definitive and strict on a range of just these topics, especially, ironically, or not ironically, the conjuration of spirits, the practice of astrology, and the transmutation of metals via alchemy. Thus, Albertus Magnus lived at just the right moment for a very brief but very important renaissance in Christian occultism, something that wouldn't be seen again until the latter part of the 15th century. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Albert's comments on the occult, while often surprising and even shocking to us, are often just buried in rather daunting terms. Further, his theological writings remain pretty conservative and even unsubtle on these topics, often just echoing previous generations of theologians, especially Augustine and Peter Lombard. However, in his more philosophical and especially his scientific works, we are likely hearing the more genuine positions of the experimentalist Albert. These works often take the form of commentaries on Aristotle in which Albert attempts to bring to bear and synthesize both Aristotle but also the Arabic commentaries, but most important of all for our purposes, his own experimental evidence and the experimental evidence of his colleagues. These works span the gamut from biology, meteorology, the study of animals and plants, and especially mineralogy, among much, much more. And key to appreciating these works is how Albert attempts to marry the lore and philosophy that he's inherited, much of which just often strains credulity, with the knowledge he's acquired either through appeal to ancient or modern expertise arrived at through ancient authority, but especially, and this is what's crucially important about Albert, especially his own experience as the result of testing. Specifically, Albert will often echo some inherited lore from the ye old days of old, and then he would note to which degree he agrees with that lore based on his own or his colleagues' experimental evidence. Now, to be sure, I'm not trying to say here that Albert is an 18th century British empiricist or something, but he's clearly interested in putting that arcane lore that he's inherited into communication with his own or his colleagues' own experimental experience, and you constantly see him in his writing saying, I have confirmed this, I don't believe that, that seems to work, this seems like craziness. He seems to sound a bit like an experimentalist. And perhaps that's on most scandalous display on how one of his conclusions is borne out by reason and his interest in the occult become married in what is otherwise a just offhanded comment on his commentary buried at the beginning of Aristotle's De Anima. At 126, Albert's discussing whether an incorporeal agent, such as a spirit or an angel or demon for that matter, can move itself or be the source of movement. And rather than just appealing to a purely philosophical deduction, he actually appeals to both the ancient sources of wisdom, Socrates and Hermes Trismegistus, such the movement of such gods, as he denotes them, or actually indeed possible. In fact, he then appeals directly to his milieu, and he says this is affirmed by diviners and spellcasters in the present day. But for Albert, he concludes himself that for his part, these gods, quod angelos vademonos vocant, et anima exaltae a corporis moventor ad de loco ad locum, quis veritatem etiam nos ipsi sumus experiti in magicis, which we call these beings angels and demons, and souls stripped from bodies, yet move from place to place, which we ourselves have verified the truth whereof with the art of magic. Yep, you just heard that one of the most important theologians in the history of the Catholic Church just admitted to knowing that incorporeal beings can move around because he's confirmed it through the practice of magic. But let's put some bumpers on that before we get all too excited. In this theological work, such as the commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, Albert clearly condemns any magic that involves invocations, conjurations, sacrifices, suffumigations, and adorations. Typical condemnation for dealing with demonic entities at the time. However, and unlike his student Thomas, Albert nowhere deals with the concept of the pact with the devil that will become part and parcel of the later witch heresy. But given his guardrail, as much as it is a guardrail, and it's never lowered, you can never do any of that kind of stuff according to Albert, how does this square with his comment in the De Anima? It has to do with how Albert conceptualizes magic, or magica as he most often denotes it, but also how he conceives of those incorporeal entities he's just interacted with and told us about as magic. For Albert, the anima or soul is above all the principle of animation or movement, specifically intelligent autonomous movement. For his part, he suggests that there must exist spiritual creatures, such as angels, but also the righteous dead, but also immaterial intelligences which are separate from the physical sublunar world and probably deathless, at least to some degree. Developing a kind of Christianized version of Aristotle's metaphysical cosmology, Albert contends that the superlunar world, the world above the moon, is populated by a series of celestial intelligences associated with the stars, with the planets, and the fixed stars, which are all instruments of causation between the very remote divine first cause and the sublunar physical world in which we dwell. These non-material celestial intelligences work as instruments of the divine will, reaching down through the heavens and serving as the cause which actually propels our world, all of the physical world. Again, all physical things, according to this philosophy, need something to cause them to move about, and the physical sublunar world could only ultimately be caused by a superlunar immaterial celestial realm. These celestial intelligences or influences reach down via non-physical causation and are ultimately the cause of such movements as the winds, the tides, and further invisible forces such as the sun's ability to cause growth, even reaching down into the darkness of the soil to cause seeds to sprout and then reach toward the light. The influence of the sun is pulling them up in some sense. Our physical world is simply bathed in these celestial influences, some of which are visible, like the light of the sun or the effects of Jupiter as lightning, or the tug of the oceans by the lunar tides, at least visible to us in terms of their effects. But most of them are invisible, and thus occult, or simply hidden. Indeed, at any given moment, the world is simply crisscrossed with a vast system of celestial tides and the objects infused with exactly those celestial influences, hidden influences which create the causal structure and the interactions of the world in which we dwell. But what if we could detect just those hidden celestial influences which rain down from the vast superlunar intelligences, and not just detect them, but instrumentalize them to empower the human being to do the will of God, a divine will communicated directly to human beings in just those influences? That investigation, detection, and instrumentalization of the hidden occult web of immaterial celestial influences is just what Albert the Great terms ars magica, the art of magic. And yeah, this is all downstream of Ibn Sina, or now we're fairly confident, Pseudo-Ibn Sina's book on astral radiation, De Radiis, known often in the Latin West, inappropriately, as simply On the Theory of Magic. Albert develops and deploys this idea over a great deal of his work, but it's on display in the most practical sense in 3 of his major books: his work on animals, his work on plants, and especially in his book on minerals. The work on minerals, De Mineralibus, is perhaps the closest thing that Albert ever wrote to a practical guide to his conception of magica. In fact, that's probably why it remains one of his most popular texts. And here he details the theory and practice of employing not only the occult powers of stones, gems, and metals, but also the processes by which those special forms which radiate down through the cosmic spheres may be captured in the form of magical talismans. Indeed, he even declares that, quote, the necromancy of images and seals is a good doctrine. Of course, stones, gems, and metals all share specific natural qualities which can be put to a range of purposes, but incantations, charactare, signs, and even sacrifices can be used as a kind of focus, with specific astral timings to capture specific celestial forces onto things like engraved mineral elements, thus imbuing them with power over and above their mere natural properties, which still strike us as pretty esoteric-y. And relying on the inherited knowledge of both recent medieval guides, but also the received wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, the Hermetic pagans like Thabit ibn Qura, the Babylonian Germa, the Greek Ptolemy and Magor the Greek, among other people who we don't know who they are. And Albert's On the Minerals proved to be one of the most successful mineralogical grimoires of the Middle Ages and beyond. It's still popular. And yet, his student Thomas Aquinas would reject talismanic magic as inevitably demonic, ultimately requiring satanic aid to be effective in the end. Of course, his subsequent work on animals and plants would continue this line of thinking, now providing encyclopedic discussion, theory, and practice for using plants, herbs, and animals, mostly parts of animals, for magical ends. From making herbal incense, the curative power of plants, or even the magical use of plants to do things like open locks, along with the production of herbal talismans which would be suspended or even worn for specific magical ends. His work on animals has to do more with the range of how various parts of those animals can be used to do things like inspire love, drive away demons. Fish livers are good for that, as per the driving away of Asmodeus by Tobit. They could hold ships in place or hold the secrets of the future in their entrails, as in the ancient customs of augury. Of special interest is his discussion of the hoopoe bird, a bird of ancient mystique which appears in numerous manuals of magic, perhaps most infamously in the Picatrix. Indeed, we even learn of combining mineral and animal magic, learning that the Quartiria stone, a magical stone of some significance in De Mineralibus, can actually be found often in the nest of just that bird. Albert also deals alternatively with a variety of topics on occult forces through his works as well. For instance, he's interested in the power of fascination, something akin to what we probably now denote as hypnosis, exploring a range of possible causes. He finally seems to land on the idea that a kind of celestial infused personality trait of the fascinator, a bit like the power of charisma, I might say, is ultimately the grounds for the power of fascination itself. He also has surprisingly little to say about witchcraft or maleficia, a topic that people become absolutely obsessed with in later centuries. But he takes it to be basically the work of those seduced by malign demons and ultimately tricked with various kinds of mechanisms to basically get their soul stolen. Again, these surprisingly sparse discussions occur primarily in his theological writings, and their relative paucity is a far cry from the absolute obsessions of later demonologists with tales of witchcraft and pacts with the devil and making dudes' peepees disappear, all topics missing, thankfully, from Albert's considerations. Further, he does discuss divination to some degree, both positively and negatively. Prophecy is, of course, possible and can be communicated via the divine will through the stars, even in the natural world around us. A bit like you can see the weather coming down the road. Indeed, the stars can communicate the divine will, but they cannot determine the inner, immaterial life of ethical choice and the free movement of the mind, or soul, the anima. Those are basically the same thing in medieval thinking to a significant degree. Physical bodies, including our body and other extended things in space, are subject to indirect divine will through the direct influences of those celestial forces out there. Thus, astral fate binds bodies, but not souls or minds. Hence, Albert's general reluctance for the acceptance of human horoscopes as anything more than predicting trends or forces at play rather than determinative causation in the form of fate and destiny. Again, a topic that's taken up into Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, with a great deal of ink being spilt about how do you square the circle of astrological destiny versus free will. Of course, it being the Middle Ages, alchemy is another domain of the occult sciences that Albert takes up, though again here with a bit more skepticism. He agrees with Ibn Sina's commentary on Aristotle's meteorology, which most people thought was actually just Aristotle because of how the manuscripts got copied. Basically, Ibn Sina's colophon to the text ended up being built into the manuscript's translation, and people just thought Ibn Sina was Aristotle. But at any rate, the argument is that one species of metal can't be transformed into any other species of metal any more than a dog can be transformed into a cow or something. But Albert did hold that alchemical gold and silver could be produced such that, at least in appearance, they were completely indistinguishable by the means of precious metal assay. So, they were really, really close, even if they didn't change species. But how could they be told apart then? Of course, by their occult properties. Specifically, alchemical gold and silver would lack the specifically beneficial medical occult properties laid out in his book De Mineralibus. Thus, while alchemy could have apparent success, it would always lack in its fundamentally occult power to fully transmute one species to another. Interestingly enough, it's for this reason that Albert places alchemy between the realm of the sciences and the realm of the occult arts, but much closer to magic than science. And this brings me to what really separates, at least for Albert, the difference between the categories of natural philosophy, or science as we might call it, and magica, the art of magic. They're questions of precision. For Albert, natural philosophy is driven by the senses to apparent phenomena marked by their consistency and the ability to put that consistency to the test through experimentation. Thus, the findings of natural philosophy can be placed within syllogistic logic, and one can, through good old-fashioned logic chopping, arrive at consistent truths. It's that logical and observational consistency that anchors natural philosophy as a discipline, as science for Albert. Magica, on the other hand, is the work of hidden occult forces which operate in perhaps necessarily inconsistent and thus unpredictable means. Well, why aren't they so consistent? Well, they're not apparently consistent to us, at least. Recall all that astral radiation raining down our world? Well, it's marked by extreme complexity. Think about the charts upon charts upon charts tracking the various cycles and epicycles of the planets and the movement of the zodiac, and even the slow tracking of the fixed stars on the background. All of those charts were there because even the seemingly regular movement of the planets became erratic and unpredictable long enough out in predictions. Further, those planets sit within crystalline spheres whereby their celestial radiation can pour down for sure, but also mix, make interference patterns, combine, cancel. They could enhance each other. There's so many different simultaneous forces falling upon the Earth that how can you predict the interactions once they even get here? This massive complexity means that the outcome of magic, outside of a very narrow scope of analysis and testing and deployment, are almost always by nature too difficult for our puny little brains to predict. Thus, with consistency and prediction not really being available to the would-be magus, magic simply can't be thought of as a science or an episteme, despite its ostensible power. It's much more trial and error, and effective magic can take centuries to work out in any detail. And that's why it's so important for Albert to recover as much from the past as possible, because everything those ancient sages had learned was really hard fought in the getting. In summation, Albert's theory of magic was the attempt to discover, understand, and manipulate unseen and thus occult celestial forces and their effects upon the sublunar world, our world. In a sense, this is natural magic, using the occult powers of herbs, minerals, and animals, but in a sense it's also supernatural in the sense that those powers stem from a world beyond the physics of our sublunar world. There's a whole different physics operating above the moon. Up there, originating in the divine will, then transmitted to the celestial spheres, those occult forces are the indirect hand of God. By grasping this hidden divine hand in nature, can the magus help to shepherd being to that great final form of causation. Final causation. Perfection. Thus, unlocking those special forms in nature, the magus can come to wield divine-like powers over nature itself, just as Adam did in paradise. Of course, this enthusiasm for the art of magic would not be shared by students of Albert like Thomas Aquinas, and thus the theology faculty of Paris would remain highly antagonistic toward the practice, ultimately resulting in the condemnation of sorcery in 1398. Definitely proving that the condemnation didn't work. There was a lot of sorcerers in Paris. The University of Cologne, on the other hand, co-founded by Albert himself, would continue more so in this tradition, Thus, scholasticism itself can be split into sort of a Thomistic versus a Albertistic form of scholasticism, and indeed this focus on the occult would be one of the features that would mark out the University of Cologne versus almost everywhere else in the scholastic world. This milieu would eventually produce the famous abbot of Spondheim, Trithemius, one of the true experts of the occult in the 15th century, as it gave way to the 16th, and indeed his abbey library would be one of the most substantial, if not the most substantial, occult libraries in all of Europe. And, of course, the University of Cologne would produce none other than Heinricus Cornelius Agrippa, the author of the famous and decisive 3 books of occult philosophy, along with many other Hermetic volumes. And that would produce a world that would remember fondly both the historical Albert, but also his focus on the magic of the mythical Albert, we might say, the magical Albert. And it would be that magical Albert, truly a mage among mages, that was already developing well before Albert himself passed from this world. His student Thomas Aquinas claimed that Albert had cast a demon from a room in a show of his power over the forces of evil. Tales even began to circulate that God had allowed Albert to visit purgatory while alive to better write on the subject. He was said to have been given secrets to complete the more exoteric works of Aristotle, producing a kind of esoteric Aristotle. Indeed, he'd even been given special dispensation by the church to summon spirits and demons in order to best learn how to combat that very evil. But all of these increasingly legendary sources agreed on the titanic learning and deep piety of Albertus Magnus. However, some sources did not always agree that he was so pious, at least to start. A famous tale told of a youth, the youthful Albert, who employed magic to seduce women, including a royal princess, and caught in his lustful necromancy, he would spend the rest of his life in penance, using just those magical skills in the defense of good Christians. Perhaps one of the most famous tales told, not only of Albert, but of several scholars of this time, including Roger Bacon and Robegrossetessa, was that Albert had constructed a brazen head, a kind of medieval automaton using astronomical timings imbued with such an intelligence that it could speak and even answer questions if those questions were often just basic yes or no questions. Allegedly, a friar found the head in Albert's room and destroyed it as a kind of abomination. Albert himself lamented the destruction of the brazen head because the astral conditions for reconstructing such a magical device would only occur like 30,000 years into the future. These medieval brazen heads, by the way, would just make a good episode in themselves, so that's coming. They kind of remind me of artifacts from like old school Magic the Gathering, like Urza and Misha. But by the end of the 15th century, there's even a Middle English poem of Albert meeting with the Queen of the Elves. Now we're in Dungeons and Dragons somehow. The Queen of the Elves, Elzachel, in Damascus in Syria, where he's given, of course, an elixir to transmute metals. Now, to what degree Albert the Great practiced magic in his lifetime may be the subject of debate, or the kind of magic that he practiced, but after his death, he, like Michael Scott and Pietro d'Urbano and Thomas Aquinas for that matter, all became mages and alchemists par excellence. But not only did Albert become the stuff of legend, but many magical and alchemical works began to be attributed to him, some even probably within the last period of his lifetime, and probably originating within his own students and fellow Dominicans. And thus we have the veritable occult library of the works of Pseudo-Albertus Magnus. Now, the problems with the works of Pseudo-Albert is that they run the range from perhaps being written by the man himself to clear forgeries written hundreds of years after his death. He was pretty magical, but it's hard to write books when you're dead. But further, many of them, especially the earlier works, are actually important and interesting works in the history of Western esotericism, and they're just worthy of study regardless of who wrote them. Indeed, as Collins points out, the Pseudo-Albertine works have probably actually ended up having a more decisive impact than the actual stuff that Albert wrote. I mean, ask yourself, when's the last time you read a work by Albertus Magnus that wasn't one of these magical books? Hold on. That's probably not a fair question to be asking this crowd. But at any rate, I mean, how many times have you read his books on the metaphysics or physics? No one reads this stuff. That said, one of the most popular such collections of pseudo-Albertine works, at least early on, is the Liber Aggregationis, which is a collected volume describing the various physical and metaphysical virtues of herbs, stones, and animals, along with a similar attached volume on the wonders of the world, which details various tales of the marvelous. Unsurprisingly, they sound a bunch like Albert's works. The Book of Virtues, or the Secreti Alberti, is a similar collection dealing with the magic of plants and other stones and animals, though in this text there's a peculiar financial focus, that is to say the magical powers of the financial virtues of these things, which we could all use a bit of that these days. Again, all of these collections are either based on earlier texts like Islamic or Jewish works on herbs. In fact, Albert's earlier work on herbs is in fact based on a Jewish text, and gems along with other things, and these writings are largely thought to be produced at least somewhat contemporaneously and perhaps within the circle of Albert himself. The incredibly popular De Secretis Mulieribus, or On the Secrets of Women, also has its origins in the 13th or 14th century Dominican circles and is a detailed account of various gynecological matters, including human generation, embryonic development, signs of virginity, the birth process, and monstrous births, along with analyses of bodily fluids, especially menses and semen, along with how to determine the sex of an infant prior to birth. Again, this is similar to the kind of stuff that Albert wrote in his commentaries on generation and destruction. The volume also contains a detailed analysis of astral influences on fetal development, especially the influence of the ominous Saturn, in terms of personality and physical development. Again, this is probably not written by Albert, but it's so Albertine in its insights that the topics from a medieval perspective, all with proper caveats. Medieval dudes don't know a lot about what's going on with women, but it's very Albertine in the way that it goes about trying to prove what it's arguing. But none of these works were included in the 1651 collected works of Albert, but they did begin to appear printed together in the 15th century and became known in French as Le Grand Albert. Again, together they were very popular and were continuously in print together or as separate tracts. I have a couple of copies of De Secretis Mulieribus. In fact, I think there's one for sale on the Rare Book site right now, and these continue to be printed all the way into early modern printing. Perhaps expanding on Albert's De Mineralibus, an alchemical text began to appear in his name shortly after his death, again often appearing very Albertine in their methodology. Even some early manuscripts of the decisively important Summa Perfectionis of Pseudo-Gerber, itself probably composed by Paul of Taranto, were even ascribed to Albert. And I've done a whole video on that one, by the way, on the Summa Perfectionis, which is perhaps one of the most important alchemical texts ever produced in the Middle Ages. But the most famous of these tracts would be the Samhita Recta, which is a relatively straightforward guide to introductory alchemy, including theories on how to transmute metals, details on various substances, equipment checklists, operations for producing gold and silver, at least in some bare detail. In this way, it's kind of a beginner's guide or a practical guide to match the more theoretical quality of the De Mineralibus. The Libellus de Alchemia, which would first appear in the final volume of Albert's 1651 opera Omnia as spurious, but still worthy of collection, is another example of what Thorndike actually calls an unusually intelligible treatise for the work of alchemy, which is about as high praise as you're going to get from Lynn Thorndike, and still a fantastic resource for students of the Hermetic art today who want to get a sense of how medieval people thought about alchemy. Typically divided into 57 relatively brief chapters, this text describes a seeker failing to find a true teacher of alchemy, but who has now learned and will recount what he has learned, and only that which he himself is tested. Sounds like Albert. That value placed on what he has tested gives the text its truly Albertine tone. What follows is a systematic treatise on learned alchemy of the period, including the construction of a lab, the correct astrological seasons for alchemical work, the various virtues needed of a good alchemist, the proper order of the alchemical processes, the necessary alchemical equipment, all of which needs to be made in glass, by the way, so you can observe the changes therein, something we also know for alchemists like John Rupesisha, their correct kind of furnaces, ceramics, theoretical discussions of the degree to which alchemical transmutation is possible, point made by both Ibn Sina and Albert, the various substances and processes used in alchemical change, and finally recipes for transmutation itself. It wouldn't be a good alchemy book without a good transmutation recipe. All in all, the Libellus de Alchemia, if not written by Albert, is very much an Albertine introduction for the Hermetic art, representing it accurately for the High Middle Ages, and absolutely worth studying, and it's going to get its own episode. Finally, the much discussed Speculum Astronomiae is also attributed and denied to Albertus Magnus, depending on who you ask. But needless to say, this is one of the most important works on astronomy astrology of the entire period, and again, one very much in line with Albert's thought. It focuses on how, while astral influences do flow down to Earth and determine the body, they do not have such an effect upon the mind and the soul, thus allowing for human freedom, a point that Albert makes. But given that the body does influence the mind and the soul, knowing the influx of such influences can help secure proper inner virtue against such influences. A Stoic idea, in fact. Thus, it allows for a limited astral influence, but again, still securing free will and moral choice. Indeed, the text seems to be following an argument made by Abu Mashar that astrology, properly understood, would actually aid in securing moral virtue, not negating it, much less erasing moral choice through astral determinism, something very much needed through voluntaristic religions like Islam and Christianity. The speculum became widely influential, inviting commentary and criticism from all corners, and to this day, the question of its Albertine authorship continues to be debated. All of these various texts would go through numerous editions. The Grand Albert would be expanded over time, mutating all the while to include a wide range of text before eventually being translated into the various vernaculars, including English. Of course, the Grand Albert would eventually invite the production of the Petit Albert, a notorious French grimoire of the early 18th century, and this little volume, printed small enough that it could be fit into saddlebags and smuggled around, was a incredibly popular grimoire, and it's going to get its own episode because it's just the most fun mishmash of black magic and alchemy typical of the time, most famously depicting, of course, the Hand of Glory, most often a mummified hand of an executed criminal, the hand which could be used for various nefarious ends, and continues to show up in film and art down to this day. The vicissitudes of Albert the Great's legacy would go through various reversals in time. He would be hailed as a foundation for the church, bemoaned as a sorcerer, reclaimed as a scientist, and eventually praised as a saint. Sadly, the works of Albert the Great remain very much understudied, and he's kind of to blame for it. Thomas Aquinas is kind of to blame for it, to call it thunder. But David Collins' recent study is absolutely the best at locating Albert in the history of Western esotericism. But if you want access to some of the litany of marvels in Albert's works, many of them are recounted with a bit of derision in Volume 2 of Thorndike's History of Magic and Experimental Science. Translations of Albert's works are just all over the place, frankly, but I'll include links to some pretty good editions of his works, especially works that are germane to Western esotericism and works attributed to him in the description, so at least you'll get some idea of at least the more esoteric-y works. Of course, Christian occultism is fascinating and a frankly little explored topic, so I'm going to be coming back to it time and time again to be sure, including specific episodes on many of the texts outlined in this episode, because this is just a very thin overview of the importance of Albert the Great. It's even in his specific contributions to the foundations of Western esotericism, and specifically Christian occultism. But until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.